And now I'm going to introduce the Executive Director of Project Look Sharp, Cindy Scheib, and she's going to speak a little bit about the work of Project Look Sharp, and then introduce you to our featured presenter, Sox Sperry, who is an experienced curriculum writer and educator who has taught a lot and focused highly on this issue of climate change and how we can use media literacy to teach and educate about climate change. So I'll hand it off to you now, Cindy.
Thanks, Kelsey. That sounds great. So as Kelsey said, I'm Cindy Scheib. I'm a professor at Ithaca College in psychology, actually, and also the executive director of Project Look Sharp here at Ithaca College, and we're in upstate New York. So I'd really like to welcome you to today's webinar on the topic of using media literacy tools to teach about climate change. We thought this was a particularly great time to hold this webinar, kind of marking the United Nations Climate Change Conference that was held in Paris last December, and also in honor of next month's 46th Earth Day. So a terrific time to do this work. For those of you who are not familiar with Project Look Sharp, we're a grant-funded media literacy initiative providing professional development and curriculum materials for educators to use in their work with students in any curriculum area. So we focus primarily on K through 12 and college education, but our materials and approaches are easily adaptable for community groups, homeschoolers, and other educational contexts. All of our curriculum materials, including nearly everything that you will see in the webinar today, images, video clips, and so forth, are all available free of charge to educators through our website, projectlooksharp.org. So I would like to introduce the leader of tonight's webinar, Sox Sperry, who, as Kelsey said, is a program affiliate and the main curriculum writer for Project Look Sharp. So I'll turn it over to him.
Thank you, Cindy. Delightful to be here with everybody tonight. I want to offer a special note of thanks to Lou tonight for helping in more ways than one with our hosting, and also to Kelsey and Sherry and Cindy, who have always done a great job of helping us prepare for a good interactive session tonight. And welcome all of you who are attending from many different places. I want to linger just for a minute on the opening graphic. We'll come back to it at the end. This was designed by Cindy Scheib, along in collaboration with others at Project Look Sharp and beyond. Really nice, I think, representation of what we're trying to do here with our work, with inquiry and reflection at the center. Those of you who are familiar with the work of Paulo Freire, Brazilian educator, recognize praxis, his term for education and action, a reflection and action, very much present in this graphic representing the process of media literacy. The goals tonight are fourfold. We want to tour some of Project Look Sharp's curriculum materials relating to climate change and global warming. You see on your right an image of our primary curriculum collection, Media Construction of Global Warming, that has 8 different lessons within a several hundred-page kit, particularly teaching about the science of climate change and global warming. If you're a science teacher interested in particularly using media literacy forms to teach science, this is a great resource for you. We'll also, during the webinar, be learning ways to support strong sense critical thinking. We'll talk more about what that means as we move on tonight. And always practice questioning bias, accuracy, and sourcing in service to critical thinking. And at the end, some time to answer your questions. And as was said early, we hope that we'll just get right into some exciting dialogue and discussion, which has been a hallmark for these webinars that we've been doing thus far. I want to mention that this slide and the next one both come from, actually it's lesson 8 of the Media Construction of Global Warming kit, second document in there, and you can access this and others, as Cindy said before, by going to Media Construction of Global Warming. So let's just begin with some chatting. What questions do you have about this particular media construction? Feel free to use the Key Questions PDF if you've downloaded that, Any questions will do. We want to start with questions and stay with questions throughout the evening. And I'll be quiet while some people begin typing. Lots of rich dialogue going on. Frank, wonderful to have you here tonight. Thank you for helping direct people to our work, and we hope we'll do the same with yours. Frank Baker does some really great work in terms of media literacy education everywhere. Who selected this image and why? Why is it on the front page? Why are we asking the same question 60 years later? One of the reasons why I put that right here. Gender bias is glaring. Yes, that's absolutely true. Are men changing the Earth's weather? And what about women in the context of this? Why is this so gendered? Who made it? What are the general beliefs and viewpoints that are represented here? These are all key media literacy questions. One of the things that we like to do when we're beginning a media literacy process is just ask a very general question, a noticing question. What questions do you have about this media construction? What do you notice about it? It's a constructivist way to invite students to and participants to really engage in what their perspective is. And then the discussion can go any number of ways. In this instance, we might spend some time talking about gender and understandings about gendered questions in 1957 and 50 years later. Critical questions about who the author is of this, and also the picture, which of course is always key to media literacy. Who's the target audience? And also how has the science itself changed over the time? Also interesting to notice that it begins with a question and then there's actually an answer to that in the very first highlighted lead up above. I'm going to move on now to another image that's from our Media Construction of Global Warming kit, and give you some time to reflect on this. This is 50 years later, 2007. So I just want to notice that we're having a wonderful blend of media literacy questions, questions about the media construction. Why are the colors so hot? Also content questions. Who were the deniers in this instance and who do they represent? And a comment from Frank about the overpowering nature of the image and the bold headline right in the front. Key question always is, what are the economics behind this? So Cindy asking, who's funding this group of well-funded naysayers? Richard Beach, who's, hi Rick, great to have you on, working on a book on teaching climate change for English language teachers, in particular focused here about a book that documents Dark Money, Meyer's book, where much of the global warming denial industry actually moved forward. Lots of very rich content. I'm not going to be able to respond, of course, to all of the questions here, but if we're in a classroom, already we've got lots and lots of very rich conversation, much of it focused on the choice of the image itself, but also about deniers and the whole issue of denial, which of course is one of the things that we wanted to focus on. I'm going to move on now to another one. As you see, I'm moving fairly quickly, quite deliberately through these to allow us to keep responding to some of the same points, but using different media constructions. I'm noticing that Frank and Cindy have both raised the issue again about economics, who the advertisers are, who's funding the magazines, but also who's funding this website, who funded the book about the deniers, and who funds the deniers. Here's Anthony Watts. If you look up climate change deniers, Watts is one of the first names that you'll come up with, someone that's important to know about if you're using multiple different constructions around questioning how people view, in the media, climate change in particular. Bias central to all this. Questions about bias, credibility, and why this picture in particular. This question about discussing the misleading aspects of inconvenient truth we will return to later. One of the things throughout this webinar I'll be encouraging us to do is to be willing to ask questions of all media constructions, not just ones we disagree with, but asking critical questions of ones that we may basically agree with, but may themselves have, of course, a form of bias that needs to be exposed and articulated. I'm putting up another one here, inviting people to reflect on noticings about this media construction. Frank's pointing out that, and I think correctly, in many science classrooms, there's not a lot of opportunity for science teachers to have understood much about deconstructing images, understanding bias. That's part of the reason that we really spent a lot of time focusing of late at Project Look Sharp on developing curriculum that's focused on the sciences. As you'll see in some of the later slides, this is a critical issue for us as educators, working with other educators, to invite this kind of critique that asks about bias, credibility, deconstruction. And Jennifer's pointing out that there are media tools that suck us in to looking at and spending time with material that we may or may not recognize as valid. Source of the infographic, really important. And who are the funders behind the consensus project, of course. Evelyn's raising the question about assumptions then that this makes about media, about global warming deniers. So this is also important, I think, to be recognizing what our own assumptions are on every side of this issue. Yeah, if it's a graph, it must be accurate. So this brings us to our first poll. And we're going to now invite you to weigh in on this poll. Should we take time to discuss climate change denial in our classrooms? What do you think? Yes or no? What's your thought about this? Very strong representation already. Vast majority of people, 95%, I think, suggesting that we should. So let's have a chat now. Why should we discuss climate change denial in our classrooms? Why is this important? If the majority, strong majority of science says that global warming is real, anthropogenic, what's the point of giving time to the deniers? Let's talk about this. So the next generation science standards, definitely encouraging critical reflection. Important to talk about it in the United States because there's so many deniers here in the United States. It's really critical to acknowledge varying points of view. I'm now responding and the chat's moving quickly, so hard to keep up. Students learn to vet their sources of info. The same reason that we should address both sides of issues across the spectrum, different views, proof, evidence, and claims, key skills that all students need to have no matter what their philosophical or educational orientation might be. Solutions that need to be discussed and acted on, important for critical thinking skill development. So many questions in this regard. I'm going to move on now to another poll, and Kelsey will pull that up for us. Now, this is a different question. Should we take time to discuss climate change catastrophe in our classrooms? And again, a strong consensus here. I'm going to read what Evelyn says. It's so related to what we'll be doing tonight. It seems a challenge that as media literacy educationists, we need to be open-minded, critical, and question everything. But we seem to be a bit close-minded about people who may not agree with us if we would deny other points of view. And I'm reading that, thank you, Evelyn, for that, because so much of what we're about tonight is welcoming alternative perspectives and doing it with respect and also questioning our own perspectives. So again, throughout, this is strong sense critical thinking, my capacity to be able to question what I believe with a critical eye. And this also means then, of course, to be able to speak with respect to other people who may have a different perspective for all sorts of reasons. Sharon points out that it's so important about how we do this. We need to give young people a sense of hope. So it is challenging to talk about a future that looks catastrophic, but we live in a world and our children live in a world where this image, this idea is out there, and everyone is impacted and affected. The question is, how can we do this in a way that's respectful, that does least harm, but that invites us to think about what's on our minds and hearts in this regard? Come back to this later, as so many things. I'm going to talk a little bit about polls, because we're about to move into some polling documents. And I think this is an important short quote to read. People tend to conform their factual beliefs to ones that are consistent with their cultural outlook, their worldview. Doesn't matter whether you show them negative or positive information, they reject the information that's contrary to what they'd like to believe, and they glom onto the positive information. So with that in mind, let's take a look at some polls and think about how polls and polling and our perspectives might interact with one another. Some questions about these poll results that you might ask. And Frank, I note that you're referencing the recent articles about science teachers. There's actually some slides on that are just upcoming. So thank you. We may well have gotten that information first from your website. So thanks for that, Frank. Frank's asking how many people were polled here. Key question to ask about any poll. We could poll everybody who's on the webinar tonight. That'd be 31 people, very active and thoughtful group, but that might represent a different understanding and construction than if we were contacting 3,000 or 30,000. How were the questions phrased? Sampling methodology. Age ranges. Karen's pointing out that many of the people who were contacted are only people with landlines. And there's a Science News story about teachers that, again, we'll see a clip from in an upcoming slide. Jennifer's reflecting on the country that people were chosen from, the U.S. in this case, and that speaks to some of the upcoming polls that we're actually going to take a look at. So I think I'm going to jump on. What questions might you ask about these poll results if you were using this slide, as a means to encourage discussion in your classroom, your community work, wherever you're working? What are some of the questions you might ask about this? So how were these person contacted, and was the same group asked over time? How will these poll results be used? What are the impacts or effects of these poll results? What's the source of the data here in this poll? Numbers add up to more than 100 in one instance. That's interesting. One less than 100. What do these numbers mean? They're just numbers. And different understandings of what human activity and natural patterns might mean. This is an instance where we don't have the question itself. I think there was a question explicit in the prior poll, not so much here. So that means that other people have taken questions and polling data and then transformed it, reconstructed it for this graph on views on climate change differing by party and ideology. And were there only 3 choices here? And a key question, how might my own political affiliation shape my own view of global warming? I'm going to move on now to another poll, the last of the 3 polls that I'm going to show you. This references some of the previous questions in dialogue. I've selected these 3 polls because each one relating to climate change has a different set of questions that might come forward, particular content piece. To guest, the first poll referenced the source, the second didn't, this one does. And again, I put them in deliberately that way because I think it's important to always ask this question: where can I go to the original source of the poll? In this case, the Pew Research Center one. The first one was from University of Texas. The second one was unidentified. Why is the Global South more likely to accept the urgency of climate change? And why is the U.S. data not included in the green area? Why the separation for U.S. and China into different colors? Is Australia included? For people in the United States, not a question that might come to the fore, but surely for people in Australia and the Asia Pacific region. I'm assuming that's the case, Mary. Don't know. What are the age? And Rick's pointing out that Latin America, very strong response to this, partly because Sao Paulo may run out of water next year. And Karen pointing out, of course, that U.S. and China are 2 of the largest contributors to climate change. I want you to notice that any one of these questions could lead to a very rich conversation in a classroom. We happen to have a wonderful group of question harvesters here. Many of you have had experience with this before. And what we're hoping is that this is a model for other teachers who may not have used media and media deconstruction in a classroom to begin thinking about how to invite media reflection into the classroom so that we can have a different kind of dialogue, one that's really based in habits of inquiry. I'm going to put up one more.
Good morning. I would like to specifically ask the students, why do you think
We have a technical issue. Sorry for that.
Good morning.
This microphone may be on. Okay, great. Thank you. I think we corrected the problem. Sorry for that. And thank you, Janice, for attending to that. So, questions about this blog post? Yeah, we're hoping that images like this will help language learners with different English capacity to be able to get engaged, particularly visuals here. So take a minute, now that we're back on one single audio track, and reflect a little bit about questions you might ask having to do with this particular blog post. So part of it may have to do with, in particular, U.S. focus on sex stories. They sell, although I expect they sell in other parts of the world as well. But as Frank says, covers of magazines are advertisements, really. They're not the same as what we might find inside necessarily. So they're trying to get people to pick it up. And I guess the thought of the editors is, cover editors is, in the United States this week, people are going to pick it up. And what was the motive for Newsweek to choose a different cover for the United States than it did for Europe, Latin America, and Asia? That question by itself, really a rich question for discussion. Where does the frog live? Actually, that frog is a Costa Rican frog, identified by Newsweek in this article by its writer as the first victim of climate change. 2007, I believe, was the date for this. And it was a cloud forest frog, 2006, that went extinct, most likely due to the impact of climate change. Well, I'm going to shift gears a little bit now. I'm going to reference actually what Frank talked about before, recent issue of Science magazine in February, an article about study of teachers, science teachers, teaching climate change in the United States. And the key sentence, mirroring some actors in the social debate over climate change, many teachers repeat scientifically unsupported claims in class. Greater attention to teachers' knowledge, but also values is critical, which of course references back to the polling about how our values, our political ideology may steer the way we look at the very issue of climate change. And then wonderful blog post in the NSTA that I encourage you all to take a look at. And in particular, I pulled this section, David Evans, Executive Director of the National Science Teachers Association, in this blog, points out that 30% of teachers emphasize that recent global warming is likely due to natural causes. A third. Almost a third said they explicitly send contradictory messages emphasizing both the scientific consensus that recent global warming is due to human activity and that many scientists believe recent increases in temperature due to natural causes. Teachers really going out of their way to try to split the difference. Why is this? 30% of middle school and 45% of high school science teachers knew that the vast majority of scientists think global warming is caused primarily by humans. Only 30%. So a really important series of articles reflecting on how teachers understand and teach to climate change. And of course, that's part of the reason that we're developing the curriculum that we are. And many of you are doing the same in your own classrooms and books, blog posts, etc. Okay, we're going to now see about a 5-minute clip from a video. You can find this on the Project Look Sharp's site. Our homepage has video on the right-hand side. If you click on it and go to Media Decoding Examples, you can find this one. This in particular has to do with teaching about global warming, showing a clip from the film The Great Global Warming Swindle. And I'll ask Kelsey to do that, and I'm going to mute my mic. Please chat while you're watching the video about what you notice regarding the teaching process. Let's keep this good conversation going. Okay, I'll mute and I'm going to play a short clip from this film called The Great Global Warming Swindle, which challenges the position that it's human contributions to CO2 that cause climate change. I want you to think about what the key messages are in this clip about global warming and the role of anthropogenic human-caused CO2. And I also want you to take a look simultaneously about the kind of techniques that the filmmakers are using to communicate their messages.
Volcanoes produce more CO2 each year than all the factories and cars and planes and other sources of man-made carbon dioxide put together. More still comes from animals and bacteria, which produce about 150 gigatons of CO2 each year, compared to a mere 6.5 gigatons from humans. An even larger source of CO2 is dying vegetation, from falling leaves, for example, in the autumn. But the biggest source of CO2 by far is the oceans.
Okay, just a short clip. What are the key messages in that little 30 seconds that you saw about anthropogenic CO2? Anybody? What are the messages about the role of CO2 in climate change? Yeah,
a lot more CO2 gets put into the atmosphere from the natural world than what comes from humans. Like they said that a mere 6.2 gigatons comes from humans, whereas a bunch of other stuff came from.
Excellent. Anybody want to add to that? What's implied by that clip? Yeah, Josh.
The way it was animated and the human portion, it looked like it belonged there, and all the animals with all the big arrows coming up made them seem like it was out of place. Like, oh, trees, they're bad, they produce CO2. And that seemed a bit out of the ordinary to me.
Interesting. Anybody else? Any reactions? Francesca?
It also seemed to imply that the whole debate about humans contributing to global warming is like dramatized, yeah.
How did it do that? How did the film do that?
Well, it started by offering statistical comparisons between the amount of CO2 that humans put into the air and other animals and stuff like that. I mean, I don't agree with this filmmaker's perspective personally, but they did a good job in like comparing the two in a light that made it seem that humans weren't contributing very much.
Terrific. Francesca?
I think what really made it seem so I guess trivializing to the perspective of global warming being predominantly pushed because of humans and their CO2. It's just the fact that the video was made in such a childish manner that it just made it, once again, trivialized it. It made it just seem like the idea of humans contributing predominantly to global warming is just like so childish and just such a simple way of looking at things, because obviously other things create more.
Also,
Ron, sorry.
Well, what I think is interesting is actually our reactions to it, because I think we all have a lot of opinions on this topic, so we think that our opinion is the right opinion. So as soon as we see something challenging that, we're going to immediately start to kind of say that it's propaganda or start disregarding it. And I think we could do that for a video that's, you know, an inconvenient truth, which is supporting our opinion mainly. And we could look at that and start calling that propaganda as well. And I mean, personally, I really dislike this video. I think that there's a lot of lies, but I think that what the immediate thing that comes to my mind is, okay, who made this? What is their purpose for making this? What are my own biases, and how is that informing my opinion of this video?
Okay, so I heard a bunch of things in there. You immediately went to some questions about who made this, what's their point of view, and what's behind that. But simultaneously, Alana, I hear you saying, but there's my own biases that I apply that makes me critique this in a way that I might not critique something like an inconvenient truth that agrees more with my own bias. The next film clip I'm going to show you is from an inconvenient truth, and we will take a look at that as well, asking those questions about how much do we skew information to fit our own thoughts. So is there truth to this or not? How would we find out about these claims that were made in that short little video clip? Where would we go to find out that information? Where would we go to find out about who's behind this video clip? So these are all important research questions for you. I'm going to move on to the chart. Okay. I'm talking now, and Lou's telling me that I can't be heard. Yes. I can hear you. Okay, good. Thank you. Sorry for the interruption. So I just want to make a few reflections on pedagogy. This is important, couple of important comments that were made as we were looking at the video. One is that students need to be challenged to back up their statements with evidence. And of course, that evidence has to come with background information that they've been taught that's science-based. Media Construction of Global Warming, the kit that we put together, is really put together by science teachers who themselves were teaching core science using the tools of media literacy education. So it's really key that we understand students need this background information, of course, in order to ask good questions and to come to good conclusions. We also need at the same time to recognize what was said is that the students have a deep capacity for thinking deeply and clearly about this and challenging their own assumptions and our own assumptions. And Melinda's asking the question, who's science? Because of course you've got different scientists sometimes having different perspectives. So this is an important aspect, and it leads me really, I want to spend a little time talking about this particular lesson, which is a complex lesson, lots of prior information about carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, where it comes from. I haven't shown you all that, partly because you can just access that for free on our website. I do want to talk, though, about this particular lesson that shows both clips from the global warming swindle that you saw and the inconvenient truth. And in both points, asking for conclusions about climate change, credibility of sources, and asking about accuracy, because there's also some questions about particular aspects of inconvenient truth that, that one can question, that are brought up in this particular exercise. This is for Rick Beach and other people who are interested in ELA teaching goals, particularly as regards this particular exercise. The English Language Arts Common Core standard in writing for history and science and technology in the 11th grade really encourages what one of the chatters was talking about in terms of helping students develop claims and counterclaims fairly and thoroughly, relevant data, evidence, strengths and limitations of both claims and counterclaims, discipline appropriate form, anticipating the audience's knowledge level, concerns, values, and possible biases. Obviously, this is a challenging, a rigorous standard, and one that really ties closely to what we're trying to work with at Project Look Sharp. Dan Fleurlage, this quote is from Dan, who was the co-author of this curriculum, science teacher at Lehman Alternative Community School here in Ithaca. And I put this in because this was in an email that he sent to me about why he would use this clip from a global warming denying video. It says, Great Global Warming Swindle, a powerful, well-sculpted naysayer perspective. And I showed enough of this program to put the kids in a state of confusion. In parentheses, he wrote, the kids were saying, does Dan really think this is true? Does he want us to buy this? This heightened their own observations of what followed in terms of critical thinking and forced them to push forward the truth rather than participating in a predictable sequence of analysis and critique. So he was really using an opportunity to challenge students' own perspectives about this. And then his colleague at Lehman Alternative Community School, Chris Sperry, and also a co-author of this curriculum, noted that our critical thinking skills are likely to be robust when looking at media constructions with which we disagree, but my own biases are always harder. One of the tasks in media literacy education helps students, peers, and ourselves to beef up critical thinking skills so we're able to think critically about the very media we agree with. And this, of course, we're calling strong sense critical thinking. In the National Association of Media Literacy Education core principles, ask questions about all media messages, not just those with which we may disagree. In the wonderful Teacher's Guide to Media Literacy by Cindy Scheib and Faith Rogo, critical thinkers are willing to change their opinions based on evidence. They accept a certain degree of ambiguity and uncertainty in the world and routinely consult different diverse sources by making a habit out of asking questions all the time about everything. This is strong sense critical thinking. Just want to point out, too, that on our website, Project Look Sharp, the Do-It-Yourself Guide is also an opportunity to reflect on critical thinking about questioning our own assumptions. In the section on selecting media documents, the last sentence in particular, don't fall into the pattern of only showing perspectives that you agree with without questioning them, but also decoding and questioning perspectives with which you might disagree. So now let's do another poll. This is on identifying sources based on headlines. One of these headlines published by 350.org, you may be familiar with that, a climate change activist organization. The other by a familiar conservative group, the National Review Online. Which headline, A or B, do you think was published by the National Review Online? And for people who aren't in the States, again, the National Review really devoted to conservative commentary. And 350.org, you may well be familiar with that, a climate change activist organization. I'll be quiet while people weigh in on this, and then we'll have a second poll thereafter. And the answer, as most of you, 90% said, the National Review Online had that, the headline, Environmentalist Ferguson happened because of climate change. This was a 350.org webpage. And so let's do a quick chat. Should we tie climate change to other social justice issues in our classroom? Why or why not? Let's spend a little bit of time chatting about this. And see, we'll leave that poll for the next one. Can we take slide 31 poll off, please? Thank you. A rich dialogue about this. I'm not sure you need a lot more from me at this point, but lots of very strong feelings about this. Many people weighing in that they think absolutely. Some questions about pushback, where it fits in the standards. Connecting dots, always important. And we have to go through the scientific evidence to help us connect those dots as well. And some people, no doubt, as Melinda says, this will seem too political for some people, but it's an important question to raise here in this webinar and also in our teachers' lounges and across our dinner tables. Are there connections here? I would argue that National Review and 350.org both are taking positions, very strong positions, about this very thing. We're a global world. These are global issues. And as hi Cindy Kramer, important to include the scientific information as well. So we're talking about creating a context where we can teach core science and at the same time dialogue about issues where people live, as has been said. I think I'm going to move on in the interest of time. We'll do another poll now. And this is based on storied leads, the sort of key introductions to stories. Maybe we can cancel out the prior poll numbers. Thank you. One of these story leads was published by the Center for Policy Studies and one by the International Business Times. The facts about fugitive methane. Previous estimates of methane leakage and shale gas production have been seriously overestimated. Or climate change, U.S. landfill methane emissions grossly underestimated, finds new study. Which story lead do you suppose was published by the International Business Times? And we have a 50-50 tie right now. I'm going to be quiet while people weigh in. If you haven't weighed in on this, go ahead and weigh in. Some people... Okay, so we're finding a strong majority who believe that the International Business Times led with this statement: the facts about fugitive methane, previous estimates in shale gas production have been seriously overestimated. And in fact, contrary to what most of us thought, the International Business Times said that U.S. landfill methane emissions were grossly underestimated, finds the new study. And the Center for Policy Studies suggested that, in fact, there was an overestimate. So one of the points I want to make here in terms of thinking about strong sense critical thinking is that it's easy to assume that a business publication would suggest that methane might have been overestimated when in fact it was suggesting it was underestimated. In fact, the Center for Policy Studies is actually a UK free market think tank founded by Margaret Thatcher. Easy to confuse that with the US-based Institute for Policy Studies, which is a community of public scholars and organizers that link peace, justice, and environment to the US and globally. The point I wanted to make here is just that when we immediately jump to our conclusions, 80% of us happen to be wrong in this instance, and I think it's important to just think carefully about where our own presumptions might come from. Framing the questions now as we're leading toward closing. I want to urge us to just think about the pitfalls when we ask dualistic, unchanging media questions about climate change. Really important to ask who's framing the debate, and is it really a debate? And then always key media literacy questions. Whose benefits from the questions posed and who might be harmed? So in this instance, particularly asking about how does the historical context inform the current debate questions related to climate change. In 1957, the gendered question, are men changing the Earth's weather, was one of the very first publications to raise this, the Christian Science Monitor. And in 2016, some people asking still the same question. And yet the historical context is quite different. How does this inform us as teachers in terms of what we want to pose as a debate or not? 2009, can people stop climate change, as The Economist is suggesting here? And then 2012, the question the New Internationalist moves toward is less about mitigation and more now about adaptation. So again, these framings, is it happening or not? Can we stop it? Are we now moving toward adaptation? Really critical, I think, when it comes to thinking about this. And finally, when we're thinking about framing the questions, oftentimes when we're thinking about the debate that we raise and talk about is whether or not climate change is real, whether it's anthropogenic or not, how much a part natural force schemes play in climate change. But it's equally important to recognize that, in fact, there are some who suggest that climate scientists are erring on the side of less drama, that, in fact, the problem is more severe that's being recognized. So are predictions too conservative regarding the impacts of climate change? And if this is the case, this is something that we need to be conscious of when we're thinking about who's framing this debate in our classrooms and why. And Margaret's pointing out adaptation scares me because I don't think many people understand how much worse it's going to get if we don't stop releasing heat-trapping emissions right now. And I would argue that part of the reason that we don't spend a lot of time like this in the classroom is that scares me is a big issue. It's an issue for teachers. It's an issue, also an issue for students. I want to move toward take-home points as we near the end of our webinar tonight. Always important to question the historical context. When was this made? Also question our sources, including the sources of polling data, which of course came up a lot in our chats around the polls tonight. Acknowledging our own biases and welcoming debate on conflicting perspectives, not shutting it down, always asking for evidence. How do you know that? And go and find out if you can't answer that question in the classroom. Support strong sense critical thinking, the capacity to question our own presumptions. And holding liberal views doesn't necessarily mean being open-minded. We've had many experiences where in audiences that might have liberal or progressive views, minds are closed when it comes to really listening with respect to people on another side. This is really important. I want to make a quick pitch before we close now for your opportunity to bring this graphic home. It's the first time we've actually done this, and that is to put some of our materials out there for people to buy in shirts or coffee cups, bags, as you can see, screensavers. I also just want to reflect on, at the end of the webinar, I hope you can understand the way that we've been working toward analysis in the service of inquiry and reflection, leading to evaluation and then action. Action in our classrooms and action beyond. As was just said, we really need to be moving this discussion forward into action. Many of us are. That's why we're on this webinar tonight and spending time tomorrow continuing to work on this issue. And we urge you to think about checking out Cafe Press if you want to have this as a coffee cup in your classroom. Also want to note that this question about how to deal with deep emotion around climate change is one that I've addressed in the article that you see on the left, the Green Teacher article from last fall. And specifically, it's talking about how to use media literacy education as a means to help students deal with strong emotion, fear, anger, despair, when it comes to talking about these key issues. And that's available at projectlooksharp.org. Left-hand tab bar, you'll see articles that you can click on. Again, it's a free download. You can also go to the Green Teacher website and see a webinar that I did last fall. Maybe it was a year ago before that, actually, on this very topic. Teacher's Guide to Media Literacy is an invaluable resource for any teacher at whatever level who's interested in teaching critical thinking in a multimedia world. You can find out more about how to order this. This is not free and available on the website, but lots of information from it you can find, and you can find out how to access and purchase it, along with a lot of support materials at Project Look Sharp. I want to invite you to consider returning for our next webinar in May. We'll be working in particular with younger learners. As this is the first time that we've really focused our sustainability education on elementary levels. We've just developed some wonderful activities and lessons, and I began my career as an elementary school teacher, so it's wonderful now, many years later, to come back and be working on using media literacy as a means to teach that. Finally, I want to encourage people to take the survey. This was really helpful for us. Lots of people on the webinar tonight. It would be great if you'd be willing to just take a minute, won't take long, and fill in that survey. Also, if you happen to be accessing the webinar archive, you can access this survey via a URL that's sent in the email reminder. It will be really helpful to us. And I'm going to pass this back now to Cindy. Thank you all for being here, and we're going to keep our mics open for the next 10 or 15 minutes to answer any questions that might come up in the chat box. Thank you so much for your participation. Just so great to have everybody here tonight. Thank you.
That sounds great. So thanks, Sox. And I just want to reiterate that for us, it's really important to get feedback on how this webinar went for you. And so we have just this short Qualtrics survey. We'll just take you a couple of minutes to complete it, but that'll help us in the planning for future webinars. I also wanted to say that we are actually going to, I think, start holding regular office hours online. And we're going to try this for the first time next week, a week from today at exactly the same time, 7 to 8 p.m., where I'm going to be just online, ready to talk with anybody who wants to chat about anything, but in particular to follow up on the conversations that we started here. So if you're interested in touching base with me or sharing with other people who might be joining on, Kelsey will be sending you an email in the next day or so that will have the link for the recording of this webinar, and also just a reminder about the open office hours that I'll be holding next Tuesday, a week from today, 7 to 8 p.m. Eastern Time. And you can join in and we can have a discussion. about anything you want related to media literacy education. So let me see if I can just read what some people are writing. Kelsey said, yeah, go ahead, Sox.
Yeah, I just want to note, I know we just had a question, Robert asked about the elementary webinar. That's Thursday, May 5th, 2016. I understand that there's been some difficulty accessing the survey. So if you can't access it tonight, we will send a follow-up email to you. Apologize for that. Don't know exactly what the problem is with that. But it would really help us, and I'm sorry you can't grab it tonight, but we will send you a reminder email, and if you just take a few minutes when you get that to fill out the survey, that'd be great. Cindy, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. I'm just seeing, I can't access it online either, so I think the hot link probably isn't correct, but you'll be getting the email, and that will have the link to the survey in it as well. So we're hoping to do that. And for the question about certificate of participation, if you're interested in that, you can just email us at looksharp@ithaca.edu. Sherry Zito is the one who handles things like certificates, providing certificates of participation, and we can do that. Let's see, what else? So I love the comments. And thanks, Lou, for pointing out that the open office hours will be also using Adobe Connect. And you'll be able to see me. I won't be able to see you, but we'll chat and also have the option of chatting through audio as well, depending on how many people are on.
I just want to point out that Kelsey just put up a link. Hopefully that Qualtrics link will enable you to do it. I notice there's still quite a few people in the room, so if you'll try the link that Kelsey just put up, that will be real helpful to us. Thank you for that. Thanks, Kelsey, for getting that up there.
That's great, Kelsey. And that one worked, so I just tried it from my computer, so that should take everybody to the right place. So if you could just do that, that would be wonderful. Thanks so much.
We're also available here for questions. So if people had some questions that either didn't get addressed in your prior chats, so much rich dialogue that it was hard to answer all the questions there. But if you've got some, please feel free. And Cindy and I will do our best in the next 5 minutes to answer any questions you have.
And so Beth is asking about whether we're planning to update components of the global warming curriculum kit. So I'm actually going to kick that to Sock to talk a little bit about what our plans are.
I will. So Beth, we're actually right now finishing up 3 different kits or collections. One for 2nd grade, one 5th grade, and one 8th grade that will include updated media literacy documents that can be used to teach in the classroom. And even if you're teaching at the high school level, I urge you to access those. They're not up yet, but starting this summer and then on into next fall, those will be available. And they're comprehensive kits, collections. We're also now in the process of a grant proposal to do an ongoing update of some of particularly our climate change documents, because we, with you, recognize that there's a need to be current about this. Also want to say that one of the things Look Sharp's thinking about is doing some collaborative activity production with some of the people like folks on this webinar who themselves have come up with some really rich media documents and questions to go with them. So stay posted on our site. We'll be sending communications to people about that collaborative activity and also about when these new activities are available. Carolyn's asking about materials available in Spanish for bilingual and dual language classrooms. We do not, Carolyn. And it's a weakness. I would love to have that happen. I know that there were a number of people working with the European Union, a project called Erasmus, to do some translation of our materials into Spanish. I haven't stayed posted on that. But we do have media documents that in particular would be helpful, I think, in Spanish language classrooms that include some media documents that include some Spanish in them. Not a great number, but there are some. And if you want to email me at Project Look Sharp, I would be happy to help identify the particular materials that we have. Very small number, but there are some that you might be able to use in your classroom.
That's great. We should get a grant to translate our stuff into Spanish. So that's a terrific suggestion, Carolyn. Thanks so much. I also just wanted to note for those of you who like using popular culture as a way into addressing issues in the classroom, many of you probably heard Leonardo DiCaprio's acceptance speech at the Academy Awards, where he talked about the importance of climate change. He's been really concerned about this topic for a long time, and in lesson 1 of the Global Warming Kit, one of the media documents is a trailer from his 2007 documentary called Global Warning. And whenever I've used that with students, they're really taken by the fact that it's his voice talking about this issue, and that it was almost 10 years ago that he made it. So you might want to take a look at that as well.
Cindy, I want to jump in here. Kelsey, thanks again. You posted the key questions in Spanish. I didn't even know they were available. So if Carolyn's still on, Carolyn, definitely take a look at these, because that's a great way to start in your classroom with some of the media documents that we do have that have Spanish language or cultural components. I also want to just go back to a question that was asked earlier. I think Janice asked, can we utilize some kits for classroom use on climate change? You surely can utilize those kits. The primary one being media construction of global warming, but I also want to mention that media construction of sustainability and media construction of sustainability Finger Lakes and media construction of chemicals in the environment, resource depletion and endangered species, all of these have some lessons that relate to climate change. But the strongest one, of course, is media construction of global warming. These are all free, available on our website. And if you want to email asking for specific lessons for age groups, I'd be happy to respond to that as well.
That's right. I also want to revisit a question that Cindy Kramer raised when we were talking about the challenges of whether you can raise issues about social justice in a science classroom. And she said, how can we do that? What can we actually do in order to approach this? So those are the kind of questions that we love for us to be a clearinghouse and a place where teachers can kind of work out those thorny messages. So over the coming year, we're hoping to have more ways, including these kinds of conversations, to encourage teachers to collaborate to answer those questions. So really,
Cindy,
really
it's about 10 after. I think we're sort of timed out in terms of our Q&A. I hope those people who are still on, many of you I think are probably taking the survey, which is wonderful, and maybe join Cindy next Tuesday. You'll be getting an email how to do that. I'm going to sign off for the evening, but it's been great to be with you again, and I hope to see you in May for the next webinar. So good night all, and good work with your climate change and media literacy integration. Bye-bye.